welcome to the first in a new series of Public Affairs Asia podcasts. I'm Craig Hoy, Executive Director of Public Affairs Asia. These monthly recorded debates, which are available via our website, YouTube and iTunes, will examine the critical issues confronting public affairs and communications professionals. To start the series, we go straight in at the deep end to tackle the often misunderstood issue of lobbying. Here in Asia, where governments range from fully fledged democracies to military juntas, the process of engaging and influencing government is often complex, challenging, and certainly not without its surprises. To discuss whether the lobbying practices we see on K Street or in the dark recesses of the Palace of Westminster actually exist here in Asia Pacific, we're joined by two senior professionals operating at the front line. Fritz Quinn is Vice President of Public Affairs and Communications in Greater China for American Express. He also manages communications for Amex's merchant business across the region. He began his career in Washington, D.C. before moving to Sydney and is now based in Hong Kong. Our second guest is Steve Okun, one of the leading lights of the public affairs community here in Asia Pacific. A lawyer by training, Steve served as Deputy General Counsel in the Clinton administration, and among his many other roles is currently Vice Chairman of APCAC, the umbrella organization representing American Chambers of Commerce in Asia Pacific. Steve has also led the public affairs function of two large U.S. multinationals in this region. So first we'll start with Fritz. In the U.S. and in Brussels and London, when we talk of lobbying, you can see it, you can hear it, and even on occasion you can smell it. But that doesn't appear to be the case in markets like China and Vietnam. So from your standpoint, Fritz, does anything resembling the Western model of lobbying actually exist here in this region?
Well, thank you, Craig. And I would say it is an honor to be a part of this inaugural podcast. Lobbying does exist. Influence certainly exists. It doesn't look the way that it does in the United States or in other places, but the actions which companies take to try, companies or other organizations take to try and influence governments to enact policies or regulations that are going to be favorable to them, of course that exists. I think what is different is some of the institutions that we see in some of the more in places like Europe or in the United States, not as heavy a number of very powerful trade organizations or lobbying firms who are able to be as effective in the longer term as they are in the shorter term. And I think a lot of that has to do with what you said earlier. It's the difference in political structures. There is no common political structure the way there is in the United States or even in the EU. And that's a real challenge for companies in trying to plan their resources in how do we deal with all of the different governments, how do we build those relationships that we need to build to a sufficient level where we're going to have an effective lobbying organization. So, yes, it does. The activity that companies take to lobby and influence absolutely exists. It does not look or smell Western at all, and nor should it.
Yeah. Steve, over to you. You've been in this region for a number of years, but you've also served in the U.S. How do you think the lobbying phenomenon plays out here?
I think what your role is as a lobbyist is that the government official, the decision maker, first understands who you are, who your business are, what it is that you do, what it is that you are trying to achieve, and then they think about what your position is, what your impact is, what the impact of their decision would be on you before they make their final decision. And so that's what the lobbyist tries to do, and that's what you try and do in any market, and that's in the U.S. or that's in the EU or that's anywhere here in Asia. And now the tools that you use to inform that decision maker, to ensure that they have your context in front of mind as they come to their decision, they can be different. Some are the same. You can have direct engagement with government officials, and you can do that through employees, or you could do that through third-party firms, and that certainly works across markets. trade associations, be they foreign or local trade associations, can be very impactful in influencing government officials in their thought process. The media, different in markets, but the media is going to be part of your strategy, getting your story into the media so that the decision makers read that and then think about your position and the impact of their decision on you before they make their change. What's more important when you're lobbying outside your own jurisdiction is to have local supporters going in and informing decision makers, and they could be local industry who are aligned with your perspective. It could be your customers. It could be your suppliers. So really, I think the phenomenon, the Western phenomenon of lobbying, which is making sure decision makers have a full context in which to make a decision, so that no unintended consequences hit you, or that intended consequences don't hit you, exists here in Asia as well.
Yeah. Fritz, obviously American Express, a large global multinational operating pretty much everywhere in the world. When you look at lobbying on behalf of an organization like that, what's the global standard and what's the local interpretation? How do you take a global brand and represent it locally in markets as diverse as Asia Pacific when it specifically comes to the lobbying practice?
That is that's kind of a difficult question to answer, and I'll try and get at it from maybe another direction. American Express is a large company. We're operating in over 130 countries. But our culture is the same. Our company's values are the same. Our business model, while it changes in some places, it's similar. And those similarities in culture and in values really permeate our entire organization. Now, what it comes down to is the cultural differences. And so our office in Sydney is far different from our office in Hong Kong, but people believe the same things. We're trying to achieve the same things as a company, and the way that we want to interact with governments is relatively consistent. Now, that's driven by our company values, but also just by policy. I think we're very mindful as a global organization that any contact with government officials, you have to be very careful. We've got training that we go through on the UK Bribery Act, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So we do need to standardize that the way that we're dealing with governments is consistent, it's transparent, and that that we're representing our company in the way that we would want to be. I think Steve mentioned PR as a lobbying function. I seem to recall reading a headline the other day that somebody in New York is trying to make PR and working with editorial boards lobbying activity, which I think is maybe a little bit extreme. But when we think about pulling that all together as a global company, we can't afford to make any missteps or to do anything that isn't completely above board. So that's how we maintain consistency, again, through our values, through our corporate culture, but also just through policy and procedures.
Yeah. Steve, if I'm kind of reading your remarks correctly, you're pretty much saying it's the same anywhere in an established democracy or in a country where decision-making is more centralized. So would you say it's just simply a case of find the pressure point and apply the pressure? And is that the same in Australia as China?
I'd say two things. First, I think the tools are the same. Now, how you go about using those tools is going to be very different. But the tools that you have available to you when you are in public affairs, be it yourself, your employees, your customers, trade associations, local industries, the tools are the same, but they're going to be applied differently in local context, very, very much so. When it comes to pressure, I think that a U.S. company may be able to apply some pressure in the U.S., and you have different tools in the U.S. in terms of the fact that your employees, could be voting for the person making that decision, and that could be something that, the decision maker is very cognizant of what their constituents may do, and you may not have that same type of pressure outside of your home market. So there, I think pressure does not work outside of your home country, and I think you have to really know what I'll call like the 4 Ps of any issue that you're presenting to a decision maker. You need to know what is the public interest that decision maker understands when you present your position to them. You need to know what the policy arguments are for and against your position, so that you can be on the front foot and be proactive in arguing either side. You need to know the process and how decisions get made. And there is not a lot of transparency at times in any government. In the U.S. government, you can have not a very transparent process when you start talking about, conference committees in Congress when it comes to legislation and when things get added and dropped. And so you need an expertise in process, so you know how that policy and how that public interest is going to be implemented. And then you need to know the politics. That's the 4th P. What are the politics of the situation? Not necessarily partisan politics. That model is the same everywhere. I don't think pressure works, though, overseas as much as it could work in your home country.
Yeah, Craig, if I agree with that. I think Steve, your analogy of tools, normally a hammer is a hammer is a hammer is a hammer. But your relative ability to use some of those tools is going to be absolutely different depending on where you are and how efficacious you can be. I think one of the challenges that multinational Western companies are going to face is it's a matter of relevance. You're used to, if you're based in the United States or if you're based in Europe and you've got a big company with a lot of employees and a lot of heft, you're used to the situation where when you go in and see a minister or a committee chairman, they listen to you because of what Steve said, that the politics involved. You know that some of your employees may be voting for this person or they're going to be influential in their career. And that's not something that you have the benefit of always, particularly in emerging markets. Yes, you're a great global brand, but locally that doesn't mean anything to me necessarily. Your products may not be as widespread. So your ability to exert any pressure, the challenge there comes from a stable of executives and leaders who think we are a large company. We should have the same sort of our arguments should carry the same sort of heft everywhere. They're just not going to do that. And I think certainly as in-house lobbyists, part of the challenge is explaining that to people in wherever your headquarters are, that yes, we do have good products, but our level of relevance is going to vary widely from our home market to an emerging market.
Yeah. Steve first, then Fritz, just quickly, what's the separation or what's the balance between monitoring the policy and regulatory environment and influencing it? Because one of the things that I hear quite a lot is people get blindsided. Suddenly something comes on the radar from nowhere. It may be a piece of Western regulation that's been gold-plated and rushed through in an emerging market such as Vietnam. So how much time do you spend monitoring and how much time do you spend trying to influence?
I think you need to rely on your networks when it comes to monitoring. And that's where trade associations and local associations are so important. And so as a U.S. company, the American Chambers of Commerce in all of the markets are very good at monitoring. They're always going in, meeting with customs officials or meeting with Ministry of Finance officials or meeting with trade officials to try and be your eyes and ears, be your early warning system. So it's something that you can have. Now, if it's an important market, you can hire firms to do that for you, and there are certainly firms that do that. I think it's very hard to have that in every single market, to have a firm do that type of monitoring. And so you really have to have a broad network Sometimes it's deep, sometimes sometimes it's wide to do that. And then if you have a regional job, depending on the size of your region, you really have to focus. You have to understand where is the biggest return on investment of my time for the company, and that's where you're going to spend your time. And it take a year or two, even longer sometimes, to get the policy outcome that you want. And so I think it's almost 80% focused on the really critical, move the needle type of public affairs, and then the 20% you spend a little time on, but you really want groups to do that for you, ideally.
Yeah. And Fritz, you're in a highly regulated market, so I mean, what would you say that separating that balance is for you as a professional?
I think the balance, for me personally, is more the ability to monitor rather than to influence. The world is very large, and you don't have the language capability. You don't have the networks. Or it's not as easy to have those networks as Steve mentioned. I think an analogy in the United States, you can have people doing state government affairs, and it's not necessary that you have somebody in all 50 states. You may have, again, you're focusing your efforts depending on states where your operations are larger or your customer base is a little bit better. In this part of the world, just given the language and cultural differences, if you were going to try and influence everybody, you would need locally based people. You can use firms to help you monitor and to help make introductions and explain the process and the politics, to hit two of the P's that Steve was talking about. But if you want to be influential over the long term, that is going to be based on your relationship with people. And there aren't enough hours in the day for a small number of people to do that, and there's not enough money within a vast majority of corporations to have a team that's going to be all over every issue in every government in every country in Asia. So it's trying to notice, okay, where are those hotspots going to be, the way that Steve said. One of the things that happens in an industry like ours is ideas spread between regulators. So if something pops up in Australia or in Singapore or in Thailand, you can bet your bottom dollar that that's probably going to pop up somewhere else. Maybe not exactly the same, but it'll be similar in a market that's close by. So then you can at least be prepared. Your radar is up for it to know that, okay, well, when the time comes, I'm going to be able to focus right where that fire is burning hottest.
Yeah, good point. Okay, time's running out, but I'd like to close maybe just with a key takeaway from you both to the same point for those who may be thinking about embarking on a career in government relations in Asia Pacific. So for someone setting out in a lobbying role, what would you say is the one lesson that you could teach them now rather than perhaps them learning the hard way, as it were? Steve, maybe over to you for a closing thought on that.
Yeah, I think the first thing you need to do is you need to build your own network, and you need to build your own network the hard way. Having, 1,000 or 2,000 connections on LinkedIn, that's nice, but that's not a network that you're going to be able to use in public affairs. You need to go out and meet people. You need to be active in the local chambers. You need to be active in conferences like the ones that PublicAffairsAsia does. You need to get and build up a knowledge base of who the government officials are. So you really need to put in that time and that investment. In doing so, that network is going to pay off in terms of making those connections so that you can then find the right people in which to present your company's position. Great.
Fritz, over to you.
I agree with Steve. I think that's you do have to put in the old-fashioned hard work of meeting as many people as you can and forging meaningful relationships, and that is not something that's going to happen. It's certainly not going to happen overnight. I think I would counsel people who are getting involved in this to be similar to what we've talked about earlier. To have some confidence, however, that your skills are relevant and that you can be effective. You just need to take that extra time, not only to build a robust network, but you need to spend a lot of time educating your own internal stakeholders that this is the lay of the land, this is how things work, and this is the way that we're going to be able to get some of what we want. You're never going to be able, I think most lobbyists know, you're never going to be able to get everything you want, but helping to set those expectations for your own companies that, okay, we can't get everything, but we can get something, and this is how we're going to do it. I think just having that confidence and that ability to teach and coach your own people.
Great. Thanks, Fritz. Thanks, Steve. So Steve Okun and Fritz Quinn, thanks for participating in the first Public Affairs Asia podcast. Thanks also to our listeners, whether you're accessing via our website or YouTube or iTunes. This and future debates can also be accessed via www.publicaffairsAsia.com/podcast. We invite you to join us next month when we'll examine whether social media really is a game changer for communications and corporate affairs professionals. And if you're interested in participating in future sessions or would like to pose questions for next month's panel, let us know or send us a tweet. Thanks for joining, and goodbye for now.